is a 7-fold increase in hospice in LA County. 7-fold.
Are announcing charges against 15 separate individuals who engaged in healthcare fraud, resulting in losses close to $60 million.
California this morning over suspected health fraud, including in hospice care.
On paper, it looked legal. Bayshore Covenant Medical Center in Miami had clean audits, polished fundraising galas, and a pain management wing that local officials had praised more than once. Then federal agents opened a locked supply room on the 7th floor and found something that didn't belong in any hospital in America. Shelves of pill bottles with legitimate labels, counterfeit batch inserts, and a second barcode system hidden behind the real one. That was the moment the case stopped looking like theft. That was the moment it started looking like infrastructure. By sunrise, FBI agents were inside the executive offices, ICE HSI teams were moving through employee housing records, DEA diversion investigators were sealing the pharmacy, and armored vehicles were hauling out evidence. Before the day was over, 21 nurses and 1 hospital director were under arrest, and investigators believed they had just cracked open a fake painkiller network tied to at least $150 million in cash, assets, shell companies, and controlled substances. But the raid in Miami didn't begin with a tip about drugs. It began with a pattern no one could explain. For nearly a year, patients across Miami-Dade were filing the kind of complaints hospitals usually brush off as confusion. Pain medication wasn't working. Refill histories looked wrong. Some patients were showing up in emergency rooms with withdrawal symptoms even though their charts said they had been medicated correctly. Others tested positive for substances they were never prescribed. At first, nothing connected cleanly.
A post-op patient in Kendall.
A hospice patient in Coral Gables. A construction worker in Hialeah who collapsed after taking what he believed was oxycodone purchased from a friend.
Separate lives.
Separate neighborhoods. Separate systems. But when DOJ analysts and DEA investigators started comparing lot numbers, discharge timelines, and controlled substance logs, one name kept surfacing in the background.
Bayshore Covenant.
Not always directly. Sometimes through a discharged patient. Sometimes through a visiting nurse. Sometimes through a pharmacy transfer or a home health referral. But the trail kept bending back to the same hospital, like every thread in the city had been stitched into one hidden seam. And almost every time investigators got close to understanding the pattern, one signature appeared on an approval chain, an inventory override, or an emergency staffing exception. Director Elena Varela. At first, Varela didn't look like the villain in a federal case. She looked like the kind of executive hospitals love to showcase.
Mid-40s.
Fluent in policy language. Publicly committed to patient access. Photographed at charity events, quoted in local health panels about ethical care in underserved communities. That made her useful. And later, according to prosecutors, that made her dangerous. The early theory was simple. Someone inside the hospital was diverting authentic painkillers out of the system and selling them on the street. Hospitals have seen that before.
One corrupt nurse.
One compromised pharmacist. A handful of forged logs. Bad but familiar. The problem was scale. The numbers didn't fit a side hustle. Drug loss reports had been manipulated so precisely that entire inventory gaps disappeared into software adjustments, emergency waste entries, and overnight unit transfers. Medication that should have triggered federal reporting thresholds was somehow being explained away in tiny fragments across multiple departments. Whoever built it understood medicine. But they also understood audits. That's when the FBI joined what had started as a DEA diversion inquiry. Financial analysts began tracing payroll anomalies, overtime spikes, and vendor relationships. Suddenly, this wasn't just about pills. It was about money moving through staffing agencies, medical transport firms, courier contracts, and consulting companies registered in Miami, Doral, and 2 addresses linked to strip mall offices that didn't appear to do any real business at all. Then ICHSI found the immigration angle. Several employees listed in internal staffing rosters had identity records that didn't line up. A few were real people whose social security numbers had been used by someone else. Others had documents linked to dormant fraud investigations involving labor brokers moving workers through South Florida under false papers. The fake painkiller network wasn't just hiding behind hospital systems. It was using human beings as camouflage. Some workers, prosecutors later claimed, were knowingly involved. Others may have had no idea they were carrying anything more than sealed medical packages, relabeled supply bins, or after-hours courier load. And that changed the case again. Because now investigators weren't looking at a theft ring. They were looking at an ecosystem. The first real break came from a patient complaint that should have gone nowhere. A 62-year-old woman named Teresa Molina underwent spinal surgery and said the medication she was given during recovery felt empty. That sounds subjective. It usually is. But a night shift nurse quietly flagged something else. The automated dispensing cabinet showed the correct medication had been removed, yet the tamper seal on the administered vial looked microscopically different from the rest in the batch. That detail sat buried for weeks. Then a lab test confirmed residue inconsistencies. Not every vial was fake. That would have been easier to catch. Instead, certain high-demand units appeared to receive carefully blended substitution lots, just enough authentic product to pass spot checks, mixed with diverted supply and counterfeit replacements entering through a shadow pipeline investigators still couldn't fully see. Imagine how bold that is. A hospital isn't just a place with medicine. It's a place with trust pre-installed.
White coats.
Electronic records, sterile packaging, chain of custody language. If you can hide inside that machinery, you don't need to convince people on the street. The institution does it for you. And that may be why the network lasted as long as it did. By then, agents were pulling surveillance from loading docks, employee entrances, and off-site storage units. One video, captured just after 2 a.m., showed a nurse supervisor wheeling what appeared to be a standard red biohazard cart through a service corridor near radiology. Minutes later, the same cart emerged from a side freight elevator, was loaded into a white laundry van, and left campus without logging through the disposal chain. That van didn't go to a waste facility. It went to a warehouse in Alapata. When agents later searched that site, they found one of the most disturbing visual moments in the entire case. Rows of heat-sealed pharmaceutical packaging on stainless tables, label printers still warm, pill presses broken down under plastic sheets, and hospital-grade gloves stacked beside counterfeit inserts designed to mirror legitimate opioid medications. This wasn't sloppy street-level packaging. This was procedural. Someone had studied how institutions look from the inside, and built a criminal version of that reality. Still, investigators were missing the bigger answer. Why would a hospital-based network need IC, FBI, DEA, and DOJ all in the same room? Then came the mid-twist. The pills were only half the business. What the task force uncovered next was a parallel machine running through patient records, discharge codes, telehealth referrals, and phantom pain management follow-ups. According to the federal complaint, legitimate patient identities were being recycled after discharge, after transfer, and in some cases even after death. Their records were used to justify medication movement, insurance billing, and digital prescription histories that fed outside clinics and cooperating pharmacies. That meant the network wasn't merely selling fake painkillers. It was manufacturing paper patients. And paper patients can do almost anything. They can justify controlled substance orders. They can trigger insurance reimbursements. They can create prescription trails that make a legal inventory look medically necessary. They can move millions without anyone seeing a hand-to-hand sale. That is when the case exploded from a Miami hospital scandal into a federal conspiracy. The Southern District of Florida began coordinating asset freezes. Search warrants expanded into Hialeah clinics, a Doral logistics office, 2 home health agencies, and a billing consultancy in Brickell that investigators allege functioned as a laundering hub. Some of the money moved through luxury purchases, boats, condos, designer watches. But a surprising amount moved through things that looked boring on purpose: staffing invoices, freight charges, software licensing fees, short-term lease agreements, and community outreach grants. Clean-looking lines on dirty books. One prosecutor would later describe the scheme as a narcotics operation wearing a healthcare badge. And once that picture came into focus, the human damage became impossible to ignore. There was Marcus Bell, a 28-year-old warehouse worker from Little Havana who bought what he thought were prescription painkillers after a shoulder injury. His family believed he was using street pills. Investigators later traced one batch code linked to his death back to packaging materials seized from the Alapata warehouse and a diverted inventory trail connected to Bayshore Covenant. Then there was Teresa Molina, whose surgical recovery spiraled because the medication documented in her chart didn't match what entered her bloodstream.
She survived.
But she became one of the earliest patients whose case helped investigators prove the substitutions weren't accidental, isolated, or clerical. Those stories mattered because they shattered the defense the network had quietly relied on.
Error. Confusion.
System overload. Once real people started lining up behind the data, the numbers stopped looking abstract. But the raid still hadn't happened yet. The task force wanted the whole thing, not just fragments. They didn't want one nurse caught with a box. They wanted the architecture, the communications, the money, and the chain of command.
So they waited.
They ran controlled surveillance on suspected couriers. They tracked encrypted messaging patterns across devices that were only turned on near the hospital campus and certain off-site storage units. They subpoenaed badge swipe logs and compared them against dispensing records, camera footage, payroll spikes, and vehicle registrations. And the more they looked, the more impossible it became to believe Elena Varela didn't know. She was positioned at every pressure point. Emergency staffing approvals, vendor escalations, internal compliance responses, pharmacy remediation memos, building access exceptions. Anytime a discrepancy threatened to become visible, her office had the power to redefine it as routine. That's what made her the anchor. Not because she touched every pill, but because, according to prosecutors, she built the conditions where every pill could disappear. Then came the insider. 3 weeks before the raid, an employee in hospital compliance, never publicly identified in the story world of this case, agreed to cooperate after agents confronted them with message logs and deletion records. Investigators believed they were not the mastermind, but they were close enough to hear things no outsider could. What they described changed everything. There was, allegedly, a hidden record space behind a movable storage wall near Central Supply, used not for long-term document retention but for temporary reconciliation. In plain language, when the real numbers and the fake numbers drifted too far apart, that room was where the system was patched. When agents finally entered it during the raid, they found the third major cinematic shock of the case.
A wall panel slid back.
Inside was a narrow room lit by cold fluorescent strips, with 2 server racks humming beside locked carts of archived labels, pre-signed transfer sheets, blank physician order templates, and handwritten ledgers converting patient initials into shipment codes.
Not a movie-style bunker. Something worse.
Something administrative. That detail is what makes stories like this feel so unsettling.
Not the guns. Not the handcuffs.
Not even the money.
It's the paperwork.
The idea that ruin can be organized in spreadsheets, filed in binders, and approved in a tone that sounds professional. At 5:06 a.m. on raid day, teams moved simultaneously on the hospital, the warehouse, the Doral office, and 3 residences. Aerial footage later showed black SUVs stacking outside the employee garage while agents in marked vests flooded the service corridors before most patients were awake. One nurse allegedly tried to dump phones into a Sharps container. Another locked herself in a medication room until agents breached the door. A records manager was stopped in the parking structure with 2 encrypted drives taped inside a lunch cooler.
And Elena Varela?
According to the arrest narrative, she was found in her office wearing scrubs under a blazer, as if she had planned to look operational and untouchable at the same time. Investigators say she asked for a lawyer before the first evidence cart left her floor. By the end of the operation, 21 nurses and Varela were charged across a matrix of allegations that included controlled substance conspiracy, healthcare fraud, wire fraud, identity fraud, money laundering, and obstruction. Federal seizure teams moved on bank accounts, vehicles, a waterfront condo, 2 commercial properties, cash reserves, crypto wallets, and luxury assets tied to nominee names and shell entities. The total value authorities announced, roughly $150 million. But the most chilling question wasn't how much they seized. It was how much they missed before the doors came crashing open. Because once federal affidavits started surfacing, it became clear this network may have survived not by being invisible, but by being explainable. Every anomaly had a bureaucratic disguise. Every missing unit had a form.
Every fake person had a chart.
Every suspicious payment had an invoice. That's the real power of a system like this. It doesn't hide outside trusted institutions. It hides inside the language of them. And that forces a harder question. How many people were truly in on it? Prosecutors painted a layered hierarchy: core operators who knew exactly what they were doing, facilitators who handled logistics and records, compromised medical staff who looked the other way, and peripheral workers who may have believed they were just moving inventory inside a chaotic hospital machine. That ambiguity will likely become the battlefield if this case ever reaches a full courtroom climax. Because conspiracy cases thrive on gray zones. Who knew the pills were fake? Who knew patient identities were being reused? Who knew IC was tracing labor records because the staffing pipeline itself had become part of the concealment strategy? And who told themselves it was all temporary, all survivable, all normal, right up until the morning the elevators opened and federal agents stepped out. By the final week before arrests, investigators believed the network was already adapting. Some batch activity had shifted. Certain message chains went dark. One shell company was abruptly dissolved. Someone knew pressure was building. Which means the raid may not have stopped a machine at full speed. It may have hit its seconds before it disappeared. And that's why this story lingers. Not because 21 nurses and 1 director were arrested. Not because $150 million was seized. Not even because a Miami hospital allegedly became the front line of a fake painkiller network. It lingers because institutions are built on assumption. We assume the bottle matches the label. We assume the chart matches the patient. We assume the person signing the override is protecting the system, not hollowing it out from the center. In this case, those assumptions became inventory, and inventory became profit. By the time the public saw the headlines, the real story had already unfolded in silence, in edited logs, fake names, night shift transfers, sealed carts, quiet withdrawals, and forms no one thought to read twice. That is what made the network powerful. And that is what made the raid inevitable. Because eventually, even the cleanest system starts leaving fingerprints. So here's the question that matters more than the arrests. If a criminal network can survive inside a hospital by borrowing the appearance of care, Does that mean the most dangerous systems aren't the ones hiding in the shadows, but the ones operating in places we're trained to trust? And if that's true, how many warning signs do people ignore simply because the building has a good reputation? Let me know where you stand. Was this empire built by a few key operators at the top, or can a system this large only exist when silence becomes part of the structure?